Welcome to Exploring Computing. Today's video is creating web pages, working with a web server. So far we've talked about how to write the HTML and the CSS, but we haven't really talked about how to actually get your files up on the web. Now, for the most part, we're not going to need to do this for our class, but I think it's clearly something that's important if you actually want to create a real web page. So it's definitely worth talking about. So far, if you think about what we've been doing for our class, if you think about what's been going on with homework, you've been creating files on your laptop and you've been loading them into the web browser on your laptop. And so we're really taking advantage of one aspect of how the web browser works. So the web browser actually has several different tasks. It understands how to use HTTP to make requests to different web servers. And then it understands when the files come back, how to actually render and display those. And we've only been taking advantage of rendering and displaying the files after they've been placed on our computer. And we have not been taking advantage of the first part where we request files from a server. We've been generating the files on our own laptop and loading them on our own laptop. So clearly, if we want to have other people be able to see our web pages, we need to put the files on the server where they can be sent to lots of different people. So what we need to do here is we need to basically reverse the process here. We need to take the files, the HTML, the CSS, the image files, whatever files are associated with our web page. We need to take those files from our laptop where we've been playing around with them and experimenting with them and testing them, and we need to actually put them on a server. And so that's what this video is all about. Okay, so there's a number of different steps, and I will go over each of these steps in detail, but let's just take a quick overview here. Okay, we need to get a web hosting service, so we need to have an actual server we can put those files on. We need to create and test the files, and testing them locally as you've been doing for the homeworks, that's totally fine. That is a common practice. But once we're convinced that the files seem to be working fine, we need to figure out how to get them onto the web server. So that's going to take several things. First of all, we need to choose the software we're going to use to transfer the files over to the server. And then we're going to have to figure out where to put them on the server. And then, of course, we're actually going to transfer them. And then finally, we should double check our files and make sure everything's working properly. And we'll be spending some time at the end of this video talking specifically about things that can go wrong and things to be checking for. Okay, so you need to have a web hosting service. Stanford provides hosting for student files. So every student at Stanford has a directory that they can place files on that can be accessed from web.stanford.edu. Many internet service providers also provide web hosting. So if you graduate from Stanford, you can check with whoever's providing your internet service. They may provide hosting for files. There's quite a number of companies that also provide some basic web hosting services. And then if you really get into it, you can get professional grade web hosting like Amazon Web Services. All right, so as I suggested, creating and testing the files on your own computer is a great idea, and that's what we've been doing here. You can test the files on an actual web server, and if we get a little bit more advanced, and you may want to do some of that on your own files, but the main thing to keep on mind is if you do transfer the files over to the web server and you have not tested them, those files are live. So people visit your website and you are in the process of testing your files to make sure they're working, they're going to see stuff that's potentially busted. So the way around this is you can have a special test location on your server and do some testing there, or you can actually run a separate test server. Okay, as far as file transfer software goes, in general, you're going to want a program that supports the Secure File Transfer Protocol, or SFTP. So there is an earlier version of this protocol just called FTP. It's still usable, but in general, it's recommended you use the secure version, SFTP. And in fact, Stanford will not let you connect to the Stanford servers with FTP. You need to use secure FTP. These are a couple sample programs you might consider for using SFTP: SecureFX on Windows or Fetch on the Mac. And in fact, these are both available for free to Stanford students and faculty and staff. And here's a website. If you haven't already visited this website, this is a handy website to know about. It's called Essential Stanford Software, or ESS. You can go to it from ess.stanford.edu. It'll make you log in with your SUNet ID, and there's a bunch of software there that you can download for free, including SecureFX and Fetch for our SFTP transfers. These SFTP programs are likely to work for any service provider that you're working with, any web hosting solution that you're working with, getting the files over there. Different hosting solutions may also have other ways of getting the files over there. So, for example, Stanford has a web interface. If you go to afs.stanford.edu, you can upload and download files using that website. Our experience has been that, in general, the students do find it a little bit more straightforward, maybe a little bit easier working with afs.stanford.edu rather than getting a separate secure FTP program. But, as you start doing more and more work, you will probably find that there's more to learn, and maybe it's a little bit harder getting used to SFTP. But once you understand how SFTP works, you may actually find that that using it actually streamlines your process quite a bit. So if you're just using something simple like the homework files, and using something simple like afs.stanford.edu would work fine. But if you're working with a actual large website, you're probably going to want to use something a little bit more sophisticated. Okay, so we need to determine what location to put our files in. And all Stanford students, as I mentioned before, do have web hosting from Stanford. So Stanford has a file server that you can use to store different files. This is sometimes referred to as the Leland system. And in the Leland system, you've got a directory there. And within that directory, there's a special directory already created for you called www. This is where you put your web page stuff. So that www directory, if you put things into the www directory, they are now on the web. So don't put anything in the www directory unless you want other people to be able to see it, because it is publicly available and the read-write permissions are set so that anybody can view the files in that directory. If you put something in the www directory, people will be able to access it using the URL I've put here, http://web.stanford.edu/tilde, and then whatever your SUNet ID is. And then if they just end it with a closing slash, it will load the index.html, as we talked about in a previous video. That's the default at Stanford, loading index.html. Or if they follow the tilde SUNet ID / with the actual name of a HTML file, that's what will be loaded up. Okay, so we now have some idea of what our file transfer options are, and we now know where to put the files as far as Stanford goes. If you're working with a web server other than Stanford's, whoever is providing your web hosting should tell you what location to place the files for web hosting. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and transfer the files over. I'm showing you an image here of SecureFX in action. And this basically has two sets of directories. There's a set of directories and files on the left, which is what's on my laptop. And there's a set of directories and files on the right that show what's on the server. And I've got a whole bunch of junk in here. And you can actually see my www directory there. It has a whole bunch of subfolders in it. But if you haven't done anything, you will have an empty www directory. Anyway, I'm not going to talk too much about how to transfer the files over. It's going to vary depending on which software you're using. And it's generally going to be pretty straightforward. Basically, you can take items on the left and either drag them over to the right, or often you can just double click over them on the right. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is you can either transfer individual files over, or you can just transfer entire directories over. So if you've got, some sort of a fairly deep nested structure of files and folders for your website, and you've got it up working on your laptop and you want to transfer them over to the server, you don't need to transfer the individual files over. You can just transfer the whole directory over and it should work. Okay, once you get them over there, even if they worked fine in your laptop, you do want to do some extra checking once you transfer them over. So if we're a professional, probably what we're going to do is we're going to have a separate testing location other than where the files ultimately are going to end up, or we're going to have a test server. You may occasionally run into these test servers actually running on the web. Sometimes people just leave them up and even have links to them. So if you see something that looks like this, www.example.edu:8080, that is actually the test server. That 8080, that's a port number. CS106E students, we talked a little bit about port numbers being used to identify specific programs running on a particular computer on the internet. And the normal port number for HTTP is 80, and then 8080 is used as a test server for HTTP. Okay, what sort of problems might you run into? So I suggest that you should double check all your stuff once you move over to the web. You can put them in a temporary testing location and then rename the testing location when you're done. You can put them in a temporary server location and then move them over when you're done. Or, if it's just some fun stuff that you're putting on the web, you can just put it in its ultimate destination, not bother with the testing server stuff, and just assume that, if it's just your friends that are going to be seeing it, they're probably not going to happen to visit your website at the exact same time that you're putting the files up. Okay, so what can go wrong? Why am I telling you to double check all your stuff? Well, here's some common things that could go wrong. First of all, if you get a 404 error, that probably means your files are in the wrong location, or it could mean that you're misspelling something in the file name. So the misspelling is actually fairly common. Although if you test it thoroughly on the laptop before transferring it over, we'll actually take a look in a couple minutes about some issues with file names, but hopefully you would have caught that. If you get a 403 error, remember that means permission not found. That means that the permissions on the directory are messed up. This used to be an issue at Stanford because the www directories were not pre-created and students had to create them manually. And if you didn't set the permissions right, basically people visiting the directory would be there, but people trying to visit from the web, the server would say, hey, you don't have permission to view that file. But at this point, Stanford does have that www directory already created for all students with the permissions set properly. Presumably, if you're working with an outside web hosting service, they will set the permissions properly. Or, if you're doing something really sophisticated like Amazon Web Services, well, then it's up to you. Don't bring out the big guns and use the sophisticated services unless you know what they're doing. They can get pretty complicated. Amazon has a huge number of options and it can get very, very complex very quickly. All right. I also recommend that you just double check every link on your website and double check your images and make sure they're all working. What can go wrong? Well, first of all, don't use absolute references. We've talked about this before when we talked about creating links. And definitely don't use file references. Remember, absolute references are references to specific locations on specific computers. If you were testing on your laptop and you had absolute references and now you move it to your web hosting service, like for example, Stanford, those files are now in a different location. So those absolute references are now absolute references to your original laptop. They are not absolute references to the new location of the file. So in general, just don't use absolute references unless you're linking to somebody else's web page, in which case that other person's web page is still located wherever it was out on the web before. It's still located there after you move your files over to Stanford. So that's not going to have an effect. But as far as links to web pages within your website or references to anything within your website, for example, images within your website, you need to use relative references for that. Okay, I mentioned this a little earlier when we talked about 404s, that there are some issues that can come up with file names. Here's what you're going to do to avoid those issues. Name your files with all lowercase letters, no uppercase letters, just lowercase letters. You can use the digits 0 through 9. You can use dashes, and then just for the .html or the .css, you can use the period. That's all I recommend. It is possible to use upper and lowercase letters, but here's what can happen. So it turns out when you're testing the files on your own computer, like you created the files on your laptop, you did some testing on your laptop, laptops and some servers don't actually care if you get the case in the letters wrong. So if you mix the upper and lowercase letters, that works just fine. So if I've got a file named test.html with a capital T, and I create a link to it using ahref equals lowercase t test.html, that will work fine on some servers, and it will generally work just fine when you're testing locally just on files on your laptop. But some servers, including Stanford's, are much more finicky, and the upper and lowercase must match. So in this case, if I had a file named test.html with a capital T and I tried to link it to it with the lowercase t, it wouldn't work. It would show, hey, I don't know what that file is. And keep in mind, this happens with links. This is also going to happen with things like if you've got an IMG with an SRC and the case is wrong on your SRC, it's also going to just show up as a broken image. So I think you can get this to work as long as you're really careful and you always use the correct upper or lowercase for the names. I think it's easier just to not deal with that and just name all your files just lowercase. Okay, I also mentioned that you should just use the dash. You can use other characters, but they will cause problems and there are some issues with them. So, I think one thing that you may occasionally run into, for example, is if somebody puts a space in the name of the file, you can link to it, but basically you need to replace the spaces in all of your references to that file with the %20. That's actually a reference to the original ASCII code for the space character. So, it's better to not deal with these %20 encodings. These are sometimes referred to as URL encodings. And just don't use any weird characters. The dash does not need any special encodings. Obviously, the letters don't need any special encodings, neither do the digits 0 through 9. So just limit yourself to using those in your name, and that should solve a lot of problems. Okay, another issue that I've seen students run into is having the wrong type of image format. So here are the image formats you should be using. You should limit yourself to JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs, and then we haven't really talked about this, although I mentioned it very briefly. There's something called SVG, which allows us to store images using an object/vector. Remember, those two were synonymous, object or vector graphics format instead of the JPEG, PNG, and GIFs, which are using the bitmap, also sometimes referred to as raster format. So we might talk about SVG later in the quarter, but regardless, these are the 4 formats that you can use. There are some other formats that you might commonly run into. Those will not necessarily work on the web. So if you're taking images with an iOS device, for example, Apple has a new format, HEIC. It's a good format, but it is not web compatible. And even Apple's web browsers, if you were to serve a file up using this format, they're not going to display it. So don't use the HEIC format. You need to convert it. Also, Google has been pushing this WebP and WebM formats. One of them's for photos and one of them's for movies. These are not supported by a little bit over 50% of the web browsers currently in use in the United States. One of the big holdouts is it turns out that Apple is not supporting it on their Safari web browser. So I strongly don't recommend using either of these formats. So if you're using something with a format like HEIC, Apple's HEIC, or WebP, you are going to have to reformat your information into one of these other formats, JPEG, PNG, GIF, or potentially SVG. I do want to caution you that you do need to use a photo editing program like, say, Photoshop. I have had some students just try and rename the files, and it would be nice if the computers were smart enough to handle that now, but they aren't currently there yet. So, definitely use something like Photoshop. There's some built-in software. Windows and I suspect the Mac as well have some built-in basic image editing software, and they can probably do the transfer as well if you don't want to spring for Photoshop. Okay, so that gives you some ideas on how to take your files and put them up on the web. I guess the last thing I should say, you guys have probably had this drilled into at this point, but be cautious on information that you put up on the web. Everybody can see it. Think very, very carefully if you want to have your name and phone number up there. I mentioned one of the earlier lectures about putting email up there. That gets all scooped up by automated programs. I haven't heard anything about automated programs looking for phone numbers and adding them to, telemarketing calls, but that would not surprise me. And it certainly happens with email addresses that are put on the web. And of course, you want to be very careful about putting stuff like your home address and other information like that online. All right, so that's it for what you need to do in order to get your files actually online. I'll talk to you in the next video.